Over a decade ago, Z coined the term the fundamental turn. I touched on this concept in my article entitled The Breaking Point, which you can find on drawforturn.com. As we all know, a deck's fundamental turn determines if a deck is top tier, as well as determining what archetype the deck is, because it depends on what it's doing on that fundamental turn. In games like Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh!, the archetype wheel looks like something like this. In Kaijudo, this game is much more linear and it's a lot simpler. There isn't a three-part wheel with combo control and aggro combo. It's something much more simpler like this, where you have aggro, midrange, and control. In a game like Kaijudo, since it is so linear, developers tend to not allow combos to exist or cards that would create a ton of tempo advantage, similar to these mistakes in other games. But of course, some will slip by, and for the most part, at least, Kaijudo is quite fair. So given that this type of metagame, the aggro, midrange, and control, and assuming that the metagame is balanced, we can determine what fits each role based on its fundamental turn and what it's doing on its fundamental turns. Let's start at the bottom of the wheel with aggro.
Drakon Rush is clearly the staple aggro deck in the meta. As a suicide aggro deck, nothing else comes close to filling this role. When I say suicide, I'm talking about how the deck is up front and all in as fast as possible. Just look at the curve. With all these small aggressive drops and all the fast attack, this deck is clearly trying to get it in. And that's it. There's nothing after 4. That's its fundamental turn. It just wants to play fast attack and go haste, haste, haste. I just broke a million shields. But with all these fast attackers and early drops, Drakons can clearly hit speed bumps. Just because you can have the early guys that can attack right away, there are plans and there are curves that can slow their roll and let them not be able to attack. Blockers present the ultimate problem for Drakon Rush. They don't mind if their guys die, they're a suicide aggro deck, but not getting for shields is a problem.
Now, I'm sure you were able to guess that the opposing deck, in fact, is a control deck. But how do we know that? Sure, the colors on the board and the lists posted online suggest that it probably is a Tritonus deck. But look at what the deck is doing along the fundamental turn. It's not going for the kill. It's playing guys to make sure it doesn't die to those that are going for the kill.
After a deck like Tritonus stabilizes the board around turn 4 or 5, it'll use cards like Mana Storm to accelerate to its endgame assets that will ensure its victory. If it's not going to mana ramp, it will use other cards to slow your opponent down, like Lyra or multiple copies of Piercing Judgment. But remember, it has to actually make it to these turns to play these cards and control the board. If it doesn't have a low curve of blockers, Drakon Rush will just get it in, and if without any shield blast in sight, it'll get very bad, very fast. This is why it chooses cards like Aqua Strider over recurring blockers that might be more. Remember, as exciting as Tritonus actually is to cast, that's not the fundamental turn for this deck. It's making sure it survives long enough to get to the point where it plays this massive creature. It's a turn like this on turn 4, where you're facing down 2 guys and you're able to take care of both of them. For a deck like Drakon Rush, as suicide as it is, this is devastating. This was the turn that it wanted to finish you off, but instead, ultimately got finished. The Tritonus deck appears to have everything. Just look at all the different card types in its curve, and the massive endgame drops it's curving out to. But this comes at a cost. A tight deck like Drakon Rush is a 40 card slim, in-your-face build, whereas Tritonus Control tends to be upwards of 55 cards, and could lose some consistency with that deck size.
Now everyone knows that running more than the minimum hurts a player's chances of drawing a particular card, especially on a specific turn. By boosting the Tritonus deck up to 50 cards instead of playing the minimum of 40, you're actually hurting your chances of having a turn 2 Aqua Strider and knocking it down all the way to 32%. Now that's assuming that you go first, but either way, the percentage compared to going first or going second, you're losing 7% of having that guy on turn 2 when you run 50 cards versus 40 cards. This is Tritonus' downfall. Sure, you play a very long curve, you have everything, you can do everything, but you're not always going to hit that curve. And sometimes when you're playing against an aggressive deck that wants to kill you on its fundamental turn 4, you need to make sure you have Aqua Strider on those early turns, especially on turn 2. And that's how a deck like Drakon's can steal games from Tritonus when you would normally look at a Tritonus deck and be like, wow, I can't understand how this would lose to Red Rush. Now Megabugs, the mid-range deck of the format. It solves the problem with Tritonus hitting certain drops on certain turns because it's a tight list and it's running a lot of mid-range guys. It has a lot of 3 drops, 4 drops, 5 drops, 6 drops, a decent amount of 2 drops. You know, it's going to have a play every turn. And it has plays for every deck in the metagame. Oh, you're a Drakon Rush deck? Well, I have Full Metal Alchemist. Oh, you're another mid-range deck? Well, I have Rizulka, arguably the best mid-range card. Oh, you're going to try and drop an Andromeda on me? Too bad, I'm playing Finbar, I'm bouncing your blocker, I'm getting in, drawing a bunch of cards, I'm not running out of gas, you're going to die. The problem with that kind of strategy? You're running control cards and you're running aggro cards. What if you draw your control curve against control? They're going to out-control you. What if you draw your slower aggro guys against the fast aggro deck? They're going to outrace you. In conclusion, know what your deck's fundamental turn is and what the metagame's fundamental turn is. Even though Megabugs has a control curve and an aggro curve, it's making specific card choices to deal with the other decks in the environment. You know, Rizulka is arguably good against Drakons and Tritonus. You're either going to bounce a blocker or you're going to bounce, a little donk that might not have fast attack. So when you're building a deck, just always keep that in mind. Make sure that you know when you're going to take over the game and when other decks in the format are going to try and kill you. And make sure you have relevant plays on those turns and on those fundamental turns. And it's no surprise that Megabugs has a lot of the same card choices as Tritonus as far as the early game goes. So when in doubt, keep that in mind. And if you're fumbling with your deck choice or with your homebrew, you may as well be playing Clear the Land.